Sunday school teacher, I'm glad that you have joined us. I appreciate all that you do. And this is a time to help you in what you do as a Sunday school teacher. And so I'm glad that you've made the time to do this. Hope you've got your listening guide outline and you'll follow along with us. We continue in our series in the book of Exodus. This is the Sunday that we're working on for this session is Sunday, October 1st. We're continuing along in the book of Exodus, and we are going to be in Exodus chapter 16. And the title of this lesson is Sufficient. And the point that we're trying to get across is that God provides for the needs of His people. God provides for the needs of His people. He is sufficient. So this session will focus on the Lord's provision for the Israelites as they journeyed in the wilderness. And after traveling for about a month, the Israelites began to grumble against Moses and Aaron. And the reason that they began to grumble is because they didn't have the same food that they had enjoyed when they were in Egypt. After God had freed the Egyptians, freed them from the Egyptians, even though they faced genuine concerns and hardships, the Israelites failed to trust God to meet their basic needs. Sort of like what we do as followers. So this is what we're going to look at. So let's look at Exodus chapter 16, and we'll begin in verse 1. And there we see in verses 1 and 3, questioning the future. The entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin. And this is not sin that you and I would consider rebellion against God. It's just an area, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. Verse 2, the entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us out of this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Whenever I read that, I just get tickled because the whining is just unbelievable. Now, this is not the first time that they had whined. We know that they had whined about, we're going to die out here. We got the Egyptians behind us. And, they whined then. We also know in chapter 15 that they whined about not having any water. And remember, we're about a month out from them leaving Egypt. And so in that month, they had probably consumed any of the provisions that they had brought with them, and their need was real. They didn't have any food. And so in verse 2, it says that there was grumbling that began to take place. And the word grumbling is troubles brewing. That's basically what they were doing. And so trouble was brewing with the Israelites. Although the people had made Moses and Aaron the target of their grumbling, okay? They're fussing at Moses and Aaron, but the truth is that they were murmuring against the Lord. They were exhibiting their lack of faith and trust in the Lord. They failed to trust the Lord to provide for their needs in the wilderness. It's amazing to think that they had gone through all they had gone through. They had gone through the plagues. They had gone from escaping Egypt. They had gone the passing of the Red Sea and all of that. And still, God, even though He did those great miracles, He's not big enough to make sure I've got food on the table. And then verse 3, Verse 3 is famous because here the Israelites voice their "wish we had died in Egypt" complaint. I mean, think about it. That's what they said. Oh, well, at least if we had died in Egypt, we would have at least been able to have a good meal before we died. That's what they said. Well, let's look at verses 4 and 5. And there we see the questioning their obedience. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow instructions. On the sixth day, when they prepare for what to bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." And then verses 11 and 12, the Lord spoke to Moses, "I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will eat bread until you are full. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." Here, the Lord declared to Moses that He would provide the food, but the provisions would include a test to see really if they were obedient. God sent this bread not only to satisfy their hunger, but also to teach them to rely on His provision. And that's what we see in verse 4. God's provision of the manna was miraculous, and it compelled the Israelites to recognize it was the Lord who sustained them in the wilderness, not their own craftiness or their abilities, but it was the Lord that sustained them. Now, the stipulation that is mentioned in these verses, anticipating the Lord's future revelation of the fourth commandment, establishing the Sabbath day as a holy day. And that's what we see in verse 5 when He says, on the sixth day, make sure that you get enough for tomorrow, because tomorrow will be the seventh day and it will be the Sabbath, and you're not going to work on the Sabbath. And then also we see in verses 11 through 12 that God had heard the complaining of the Israelites and He was responding. His provision would show them that He was God. Look at verses 13 through 18, and there we see the questioning of the provision. So at evening, quail came and covered the camp. In the morning, there was a layer of dew all over the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, there were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, "What is it?" because they didn't know what it was. Moses told them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord commanded. Gather as much as each person needs to eat. You may take 2 quarts per individual according to the number of people each has in his tent." And then verse 17, so the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. When they measured by quarts, the person who gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as they needed to eat. The Lord provided the meat in the evening and bread in the morning. These were migratory birds, quail, with short wings and weak powers of flight. And that's what we see in verse 13. So these animals came in and covered the ground. They arrived in such numbers that they covered the camp. Basically, it was easy for them to be captured. The reference to the layer of dew prepares the reader for the Lord's provision of the manna. The bread appeared, and the people asked, "What is it?" in verses 14 and 15. And that's significant because the words, "What is it?" are translated in Hebrew, manna. So they are saying, well, what is it? They walk out and they go, manna, manna, manna. What is it is what they're asking. What is it? When you say the word manna, you're saying, what is it? Every household was to take what they needed in verse 16. And again, the Lord was teaching them. We see in verses 17 and 18 that no matter how much or how little each person gathered, it came out the same. So you go out there, you get your bushel basket, you gather up all the manna, put it in your bushel basket, you put it in your dump truck, whatever you got, and finally when you bring it together, guess how much you got? You got a quart. No matter how much you gathered, God only allowed it to be enough for what you would eat that day. And then some poor, feeble little lady goes out there and she gets all that she can do. Well, when they go and measure that, guess how much? It's 2 quarts. The Lord provided. No matter how much or how little we do, the only source of satisfaction for us is God. Not our efforts, not the work we do, not how little or how much. The satisfaction will only come from God. And then let's look at verses 19 and 20. And there we see questioning the next meal. Verses 19 and 20. There it says, Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. Verse 20 again is not surprising because verse 20 begins, but they didn't listen to him. Some people left part of it until morning, and it bred worms. Some translations say maggots, and I just, and it stank. Therefore Moses was angry with them. So we have Moses warning the people, you're not going to be able to hoard this. You're not going to be able to stockpile it and save it for a rainy day other than what takes place on the 6th day for the 7th day. You can't keep it overnight. You have to only use what you have for one day. So there were some that goes, that doesn't apply to me. I'm special and I get an exception, and so we're going to get more manna and put it in the storehouse. Well, just picture in your mind the maggots. Okay, that's what happened, is that the maggots came. And I'm not talking about just a handful of maggots. I'm talking about maggots crawling everywhere. That was not a pretty scene, not a healthy scene. And then not only did you have the nastiness of the maggots messing up everything, but it says that it began to stink. Now, I don't think you understand what that means. Every now it smells bad, and we go, this began to smell like a trash heap. Go to your county dump and stand there for a day. Well, that's what it smelled like. It wasn't a pleasant odor, and they couldn't get away from it, and you couldn't get used to it. You see, this behavior of the Israelites here just demonstrated their lack of faith. And we are to be obedient and to trust for His provisions because He is sufficient. Well, let's think about bringing this lesson. There's a couple points here that I want you to make sure that you hit on. Number one, believers must guard themselves against doubt and fear. As Christians, we are not to be people of fear, but we are to be people of faith. We are not to be people of doubt, we are to be people of trust. And doubt and fear are opposite of who we should be. Number two, God designs tests that require us to depend on Him in greater ways to strengthen our trust in Him. That's what all this is about. He is helping the Israelites in their journey of growing in their faith and trust in Him. The same is true for you and I. Every day as we go through the challenges of life, they are just opportunities for us to grow stronger in our trust of Him. Number 3, believers should show gratitude when God provides for our daily needs. So as we, every day when you have that meal, and I probably, many of us get in just the routine of saying the blessing, but really it's saying, Lord, this is here because you've given it to us. We need to be grateful for all of His provisions, for our food, for our house, for our clothes. No matter what we have, we need to have an attitude of gratitude. And then number 4, believers express trust in God through obedience to His commands. Don't be like the nation of Israel when He said, don't hoard it, don't try to store it up, or don't mess up God's plan. Trust Him. Don't try to make God's plan better because you can't. Let's think about teaching this lesson. What are some things that we can get them focused on this lesson as they come into the room? Well, ask them to list the things that they pack for a long journey. And then you teach the lesson, and then you bring it to a close. And the closing challenge here would be to have the group to discuss the ways that they have not trusted God for His sufficient provisions this week. What ways have you not expressed trust in God for His provisions? And then close in prayer, allowing each person time to respond to God in a personal prayer time. So close in a silent prayer for the group. Let them spend some time reflecting on how they've not trusted, and then close in a verbal time of prayer for your group. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this lesson this coming Lord's Day. God bless you.